Hello and welcome to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. In this short episode, Austin and I reflect on the insights we gained from the recent series on Exvangelicalism and introduce the topic of our next series, Christian Nationalism. I hope you enjoy hearing these key takeaways from past episodes and getting some teasers for the kinds of questions we're going to address in the coming months. Thank you for listening. Well, here we are, Austin. Hi.
Yes. Hello.
How's it going?
Yeah, doing well.
Great. And here we are at the end of a short series on Exvangelicalism. Short, but very illuminating, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we learned a lot from talking to the people that we did. That was a really interesting conversation.
So, and we wanted to talk about this because the evangelical movement seems to have been growing, especially in the last 10 years, especially in the States, although probably in other places. And so it's becoming its own sort of a force in Christianity and maybe even in politics.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's having, some significant impact with broader sort of cultural and political movements. And so we thought, it might be interesting to see, just get a better handle on what's going on, what the different terms mean, and what the implications of this might be more broadly.
Yeah, so we started off just by getting a definition of evangelicalism straight with one of the best scholars of evangelicalism out there, Mark Knoll.
Yeah, it was great to talk to Mark, and I think it was really helpful. You know, he sort of had a sense of what evangelicalism sort of was in the past, if we could sort of distill that down, although that's complex, how that's changed in recent years. And we talked to him, some about this sort of, maybe a lot of what's being rejected, it has to do with what evangelicalism looks like in the late 20th, early 21st century in particular.
Yeah, that's right. And because when I pushed him to talk about evangelicalism, even though I hadn't prepared him for that, he actually seemed to define it very, very broadly as just anybody who ceases to be evangelical. So he even mentioned something like John Henry Newman, who's hardly a poster child for what people who self-identify as ex-evangelical now. He went more conservative rather than more liberal.
Yeah. So he did have a sense of, people have left evangelicalism from the beginning, and does the history of that tell us anything? And I think it is interesting how different some of those examples from the past are from what we're seeing today.
Yeah, that's right. And I teach here at the seminary. I just teach one section on evangelicalism as part of a sort of landscape of contemporary Christianity. And one of the things I point out to them is that it's so recent that it's possible to be a non-practicing evangelical, right? It's so recent that people can self-identify as evangelical and still not go to church. And Mark Knoll talked about this as well, didn't he? He was like, it used to be the definition of evangelical was somebody who is practicing their faith. We're the serious ones, the real Christians, as opposed to all the nominal Christians. And that's just changed only in the last 10 years, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the rallying cry for early evangelicals was real religion. We're the ones who take this very seriously. We're very devout. We can think of the early Methodist movement as a key example of this. I do think it's quite recent that, as evangelicalism has more and more been kind of watered down as a cultural identity in America, it becomes increasingly possible to sort of adopt that identity without any of the, concomitant practices and kind of broader ways of being that originally were central to what evangelicalism is.
Yeah, so it's a constantly changing scene, and it's sort of almost hard to keep up with. There's no stable terms on the field, as it were. But
yes, exactly.
We then interviewed Emma Fayas, who's a researcher on evangelicalism itself, and she gave us some very interesting insights, didn't she?
Yeah, she really knows so much about this. She's she's done a lot of work on evangelical podcasts. She's listened to all of them and the kinds of things that they're talking about and the people they're talking with, which is, so she probably knows the most of anyone we spoke to just about this broader movement and what's going on. And, she gave us the terms exvangelical and post-evangelical to distinguish between ex-evangelicals being anyone who's sort of no longer evangelical, and post-evangelical, I think, being people who remain Christian and are sort of forming their own forms of Christian identity that aren't evangelical, but sort of retain aspects of evangelicalism, right? So these sort of post-evangelical churches and stuff. So I thought that was a helpful sort of distinction.
Yeah, that's right. I remember she was also the one talking about how even when people leave evangelicalism, they return certain evangelical instincts or ways of looking at the world. And I think the example she gave was a moment of conversion, a moment where you realized that evangelicalism was right or that it was wrong. You convert into evangelicalism and you convert out of it, rather than this sort of gradual growth or being born into something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really insightful to think about the ways in which that broader, which we again brought up again with Karen Swallow Prior, but the, sort of aspects of this social imaginary, this evangelical social imaginary, maybe we could call it, that
Yes.
very much retained when people leave evangelicalism, or even shape the way that they leave it.
You can, what's the saying? You can take the person out of evangelicalism, but you can't take the evangelicalism out of the person. They retain some of those instincts, yeah. And perhaps the evangelistic instinct as well. Like, I want to persuade everybody else to think the same way I do. A lot of effort going into, like, trying to convert other people to the cause, as it were.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, a strong commitment to very particular ways of thinking about God and faith, such that often rejecting evangelicalism means rejecting God altogether, right? It has often having difficulty asking broader kinds of questions about ways of thinking about that might lead them to different denominations or traditions, which obviously plenty of them are doing. But I think that is one of the interesting carryovers.
Yeah, that's right. And then that also came through with Sarah McCammon, the interview with Sarah McCammon, which was a very interesting, or sort of almost quite profound mix of her own personal experiences and her research as a journalist, drawing on both of those things at the same time. But she gave us some of the insights into why people are leaving, at least in the States. What is it that is prompting people to abandon the evangelical ship, as it were?
Yeah, and she, her book, I think, is such a good example of drawing together her own personal life and reporting on what's going on broadly, and seeing, she there's so much that she loves and appreciates about growing up in this kind of world, but also she's very clear about the kind of problems and how those impacted her, but also how they're impacting others, and, asking these kinds of questions about how evangelicals have typically positioned themselves in relation to other people in society, the kind of media that they engage with. And in her book, she talks even more about topics like, sex and marriage. And we talked a bit about politics, but there's so many aspects to this. And I think it was helpful, for her, it's interesting because all of these different aspects, they converge on her story. But I think for a lot of evangelicals, it's probably a couple of them in particular that were really...
Yeah, not all of the different issues at once. Like, for some, it could be a changing views of sexuality and what is and isn't allowed in that area. Or for others, it could be just not wanting to identify with a group that's so closely aligned itself to the Republican Party in the States, for example.
Yeah, that's right. And and so many other things besides. I think it's just really helpful to see. And for evangelicals, I think it's really helpful to just recognize that, like, any kind of massive, faith movement, and especially kind of cultural movement, is going to always have, like, a shadow side to so much of it.
Indeed.
And seeing what that side is and what people's experience of that is, I think, is just really vital for sort of thinking about the future of these communities and those that kind of remain. How do they address and respond to those things?
Yeah, it's just that the movement's been big enough and old enough now to get its own shadow side, just like there's always been a shadow side to the Catholic Church, for example. Yeah, absolutely. And it was very interesting talking to Karen Swallow Prior as a sort of counterexample, somebody who's been very critical of the evangelical movement, but still remains within it and identifies as part of it, saying, look, there are problems, admitting there's problems, but they're fixable. We need to work to fix those problems instead of like the whole thing is corrupt, so irrevocably corrupt that the only thing to do is to leave.
Yeah, and she's such an interesting example of someone who's, I mean, she kind of said like she didn't really grow up in what we now think of as like mainstream evangelical culture, partly because she just lived, it was, so before some of that became as big as it is, and also kind of where she grew up. But she did teach at, Liberty, which is sort of one of the beating hearts of American evangelicalism in many ways, has been for a while, and also, a prime example of some of the worst aspects of it in terms of its leadership. And so I
Although,
think,
didn't the band DC Talk come from Liberty University?
I don't know, they might have. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
I think I saw that on Wikipedia once. So
That's
there's some good
interesting.
stuff that came out as well. Though that's already back in like what 1997, so that's a long time ago now.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so I mean, I certainly a mix of all of those things, and
Yeah.
having experienced all of that, and the fact that she's still very committed to, evangelicalism, I think is says a lot. And she was just very insightful, drawing, thinking about social imaginary as a kind of broader category that's not just about politics or kind of social questions or theological questions, but this broader sense of how people view the world, and the kind of ways that has hampered them as a community more broadly. I think she brought a lot of kind of precision to how she thinks about that.
Yeah, she did. And so what do you think, what questions remain to be answered? What did we not cover that we might want to cover? Or what are we still interested in finding out more about with this movement?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we did want to talk about, which we didn't end up doing an episode on, was just recognizing that most of what we're talking about is white evangelicalism, particularly in America. And so thinking about Black evangelicals and Latino evangelicals, there's broader, communities that have in many ways had some similarities, but also some very, very distinct differences, and a different and thus, evangelicalism hasn't sort of touched those communities in the same way, or looks very different.
Yes,
I
the whole
know.
racial dimension of it,
Um,
which, yeah, we did try to get somebody to talk about that, but everybody was too busy in the end, so we weren't able to address that. And the other thing I would have loved to address is how different this looks outside of America. It
mhm.
was a sort of a very America-focused series, it seems, at least to me, speaking as a Brit, even though I live in America. I did push a couple of our interviewees to talk a little bit about that, but they didn't seem to know very much. Like Sarah McCammon just said, no, I think it's the same. It's the same outside of the States. You get this same sort of push to a greater conservatism, especially with regard to sexual ethics and that kind of stuff,
Mm.
which may be true, but in my experience or judging from my own encounters with non-American evangelicals, I've not met almost any who want to align with that sort of Republican Party
Mhm.
ideal, who like Donald Trump, who think that he was a good thing, or who would want to support similar people in their own countries.
Yeah, right. I do think that, I mean, that's been my sense as well, is obviously there are those people, but that they're not necessarily the mainstream of what evangelicalism looks like in other places. Um, and and one thing that I find is difficult is that so many of the American evangelicals I know who have traveled the world with to meet other evangelicals like them in other places. And so their
Yeah.
sense is that the world is all just like them, but it's just because they have networks of people just like them that have sort
Oh,
of
the echo chamber is so hard to escape, isn't it?
yeah, that's right. So finding your way into Christian or even evangelical communities that think differently often is difficult for American evangelicals who are traveling abroad. And so to get a broader sense, but certainly in England, but in many other places, in Canada where we both were as well, evangelicalism looks quite different in many ways.
I think it's sort of less polarized, less affected by the political polarization in the States. So, like in the UK, for example, evangelicals can still be very socially conservative with regard to like sexual ethics and marriage and that kind of thing. But at the same time, they'll also be very, very strongly supportive of immigration and of welcome of strangers,
Mhm.
and something which in America is seen as the polar opposite. You can't be both of those things in America.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. And that I think, for me it seems like the political polarization is in many ways the sort of driving force behind evangelicalism. So many of these other issues are driven by the fact that evangelicals have
Mm.
had a hard time holding together all of the things that Jesus teaches. They have to pick the ones that match one party or the other and sort of ignore the rest. And that kind of hypocrisy is what I think evangelicals are seeing and saying, listen, if we can't, if we can't do both of these things, love all the people that Jesus told us to love in the ways that we're supposed to, and we're going to pick and choose based on our political party, then maybe this whole thing was a sham. And I think that we saw that quite a lot with the people sort of voicing what evangelicals are saying.
Yeah. So there's lots more to explore and discover in that area, but I think for us it's time to move on to a new topic and a new series. I think something that flows very naturally from the political dimension of what we're talking about is the larger question of Christian nationalism. This question of Christians' association with politics, a certain political party, how Christians engage in politics and how Christians ought to engage in politics. Because what we've seen in this evangelical movement is a lot of the evangelicals are reacting against the alignment of Christianity with a particular political ideal. But then that leads to them aligning themselves with the opposite political ideal or party. What remains true in both those cases is that they want to be involved in politics. They think that Christians should be involved in politics, that Christians should seize power and use it in a certain way. And so I think that it flows naturally to think more about this growing nationalistic trend, which is not only in America at all. You see it very much in Europe, in Australia, in a lot of other different countries, this growing trend of an identification between your faith and your nationality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it raises multiple questions of both nationalism as a concept and where that's leading us, and then how do Christians relate to these forms of nationalism, and on all the I think such fascinating questions of there's so much complexity involved in a Christian saying, I want to advocate for Christian views in terms of how my government functions, for instance. But the question is, how does that position them in relation to what does patriotism look like? What does civic involvement look like? All of these kinds of questions. I think there's a sort of a range of answers. And this term Christian nationalism has become a kind of flashpoint in the culture for thinking about that kind of question.
It's sometimes a bit almost unhelpfully used because people don't define it carefully. They don't know quite what they mean by it. So anything like somebody praying in front of an American flag is suddenly, that's Christian nationalism. Oh, whereas I think what we want to do in this series is shed a little bit, make some fine distinctions, make some careful distinctions, ask ourselves, like, what is a Christian's attitude supposed to be towards the nation that they grew up in or the nation that they currently live in? Should they be involved in politics? Should you love your nation? Is that okay? Is that okay to love your nation? To be proud of your nationality? Is that okay? Those kinds of things is the right place to start.
Yep, I think that's right. And try to, recognize that this is a question that's not new. We can think of like Augustine's City of God as a great example of someone wrestling with this kind of thing all the way back in the 5th century and all the way through. Christians we have so many resources to draw on from Christians kind of wrestling with this sort of issue. But also, modern nation states are a particular thing that's different from, say, empire or some of the other contexts in which Christians have wrestled with these things. And so, I think just wanting to sort of clarify some of the terms and talk to some people that can give us some deeper resources to help Christians and others, rather than an either or Christian nationalism or not. Let's think about some of the core issues and the sort of range of options that we have and how we might navigate those well.
Yeah, I think that's a good approach. Some of the questions that I really want to get to the heart of, like, to what extent should the government be enacting Christian values or even enforcing Christian values on a society? Is that a legitimate Christian thing to do? If it is, what are those values? That might be another contested issue. And also, what is Christians' relationship to the use of political power in general? Should Christians ever use political power? If they should, how? Are there legitimate and illegitimate ways of using power? It gets to the heart of some very, very complex and difficult issues that, as you say, Austin, that have been with us throughout history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so then also questions of if you think of the liberal project as one that is mostly about keeping us from stepping on each other's toes rather than pursuing a particular vision of human flourishing, do Christians have a reason to be invested in the liberal project, even though we also have a particular vision of human flourishing? If not, right, what kinds of alternatives are Christians pursuing? And what does this look like in different contexts, right? One of the problems with Christian nationalism is that term has mostly been focused on the U.S., but this is a global question, and Christians in different countries are sort of engaging it differently. So I think also being able to expand out is really, really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question in Europe as well right now. I did some research for the book I'm writing on its role in Hungary, its role in Poland, its role in France and Germany, and this question of to what extent people are identifying their nationality and their faith such that everybody else of that nationality really ought to have the same faith, and we want to keep out people of a different faith and not let them into the nation, that side of thing.
Yeah, and this, just realizing, this, the Reformation looks a lot like this. Think about, right, we end up with Luther in Germany and, the Church of England, and, all that Europe becomes sort of these countries are identified with particular Christian denominations.
Yeah, the nation state sort of seizes control over certain church institutions or forms its own ecclesial institutions that are subordinate to the nation state, which, has all kinds of repercussions for the modern day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's, and so then you end up with these fundamental questions of, if you think of some of what's happening in late medieval Europe is the church is sort of fighting for power over the state, and certainly Protestants opt for the opposite. They opt for, by and large, the state to have power over the church, right? Luther's using a prince to kind of protect him and enforce his religious views in his area. Calvin's going to do the same. And so these basic questions of how should that be balanced? What would that look like? What sort of ends is that serving? Yeah.
So stay tuned, and we'll be outputting episodes on this fascinating, controversial, heated topic very soon.
This episode is sponsored by the Palm Beach Atlantic University School of Ministry. Located in the heart of West Palm Beach, Florida, PBA offers a range of undergraduate and graduate programs in theology, Bible, ministry, missions, chaplaincy, and apologetics. Learn more at pbaschoolofministry.com.